I guess my question is...
You gotta do that in the microphone.
So, we live in a country where 52% of white women voted for a completely unqualified candidate against a woman who may have been the most qualified. So, what do you tell young women in this room in high school or college about their dreams and what they face to take on the leadership?
Part of the challenge that Hillary faced, part of the challenge that many of us face, is that we have been trained not to believe that qualifications for women are actually the qualification for the job. We are told, in fact, I have a whole slew of reports that tell me that I have to be both qualified and likable, but not too likable so that people don't think I can do it, but not so qualified that people are afraid of me, but just likable enough and disqualified enough. And I've got to do that, well, not being too black, but be sufficiently black. I have natural hair, which causes some consternation, but if I don't change my hair, then I seem inauthentic, but if I do change my hair, I seem more accessible. So at a certain point, you're just like, I'm just gonna sit still. Part of the responsibility that we all have for that 52% that got confused about what we needed is that we have to change the narrative. We have to change the dynamic, and the only way you create change is by people seeing something different. That's one of the reasons I think my campaign is so important and the way I'm running this campaign. I did not change my hair despite the consultants who thought that I should, and I did not go on a slim fast diet immediately. I am, as someone described me, I am a tall, sturdy woman. And I'm good with that. It got me this far. But part of it is we have to start, what I would tell those young women, what I would tell anyone, is part of our ability to change is our ability to accept who we are and to start celebrating the differences that we have. Part of the challenge with Hillary was that she wasn't what people wanted her to be. She was authentically herself. And until we start to accept authenticity as a reason to vote for someone and not as a disqualification, we can't get there. But it's also about those who have power lifting up those who don't have power. Those who do look like the stereotypical person, saying that the different person is probably the better choice. Because we are conditioned by our communities to accept the word of those who seem to have all the power, and that typically is white men. And so the extent to which there's a common responsibility, we're not going to make things different. But that's one of the reasons I wrote this book, is we have to have those conversations, because we can't even start to confront the question until we acknowledge that there is a question out there to talk about.
Thank you very much for being here today, and thank you for your words. I'm a college student here in the Washington, D.C. area, and I'm seriously considering working on special needs and inclusion related issues in the context of public service after completing my studies. One thing that I was wondering is what do you think is particularly important to know about communication in the context of public service, and what would you say are some of the most meaningful things that you've learned about communication?
I think being able to tell stories is critical, because most people, when they take in information, they try to process it in a way that they can hold it. And when you tell a story, you give humanity to the information that you're sharing. Everything can't be a story, but stories help contextualize, and they help people find themselves in that space. And so I try to find ways to use stories to illustrate what I'm talking about. I think it's also important not to dumb down what we say. There are those who caution me not to use big words. I love language. It makes me very happy. And I think there are lots of words that we just don't use enough. Logorrhea is one of them. Sometimes I might be accused of it. But part of it is it's trying to calibrate between wanting to make certain people hear you and can understand you, but also challenging them to learn more than they intended to. And so I think it's telling stories to contextualize, but it's also challenging people in a way that's safe and effective. And so if I use larger words or if I use complex ideas, I always then try the next moment to contextualize it so people understand what I'm saying, so that they can hear the word, hear the phrase, hear the theory, and they can hold it, but then I give them space so they can actually understand it. Because it's not communication if it's one way. It's not communication if you're just telling. It's only communication if people can then take it in use it. People like to tell stories. They like to appropriate stories. I did at the very beginning of this talk. It was a great story that Aaron Sorkin probably heard at a bar one day. And I used his story to start my story. And I want someone to use my story to start their story. And I want them to take the complex ideas that I have about stereotype threat, about being fearful, and use that to tell their own story, because I think you have a story to tell and you have a lesson you want people to know. And so it's giving yourself the space to give them a story so they understand it, and challenging them to learn more about it when they do. Yes, somebody talk.
Hi. So I'm particularly struck by your background as an author, because I think so many times that young people are looking towards running for office, they're scared of presenting anything that could at one point be twisted in a political campaign, and particularly romance, which has got such lovely opinions about it all the time. Was there a point when you were publishing romance novels and knowing that you wanted to be a politician where you were worried about how that would present to the public, and if so, how did you go about justifying it to yourself?
I have been fairly aggressively not worried for a while. I tend to have slightly iconoclastic goals. And what I mean by that, so I wrote my first romance novel I published it the same year. I published an article on the cognitive dissonance of the unrelated business income tax exemption. Yes, raise your hand if you read my paper. And I was publishing them at the same time, and Google was just coming into real prominence. And a friend of mine told me about it, and Will was like, have you Googled your name? I'm like, I don't know what that is. And he's like, just try it. So I Googled my name and realized that another paper I'd written way back when on, I actually wrote on Mesopotamia and astronomy. I thought I was gonna be a physicist for a while. But anyway, that's a whole other story. But anyway, my point being, by the time I started writing my first novel, I realized that if I was either going to own what I was or I wasn't. And throughout high school, throughout college, I'd been slightly different than others. And I'd gotten to the place, especially in college, where I realized this is who I am. I'm never going to do something that is going to embarrass my parents, but that was my standard. As long as they weren't going to be embarrassed by what I did, I was good. And so my mom and dad, my mom was a librarian, my dad was a shipyard worker. They're now Methodist ministers, so that embarrassment threshold got really, it changed dramatically. And so my mom had to be able to read my romance novels because all the old women in her church wanted to read them. So I'm much more evocative than a 50 Shades of Grey novel. But for me, there was no embarrassment about it, because I love romance novels. They are good books. The best writers are some of the most creative storytellers who create complex characters and take what can be a very reductive story. Woman and man meet, they have conflict, they fall in love, and they decide to do something about it. That's it. But what romance novelists who are good do, they make it so interesting every single time that you keep coming back. And so I'm not ashamed of romance novels, but to the core of your question, other people might be. And for me, the standard is, am I comfortable putting my face and my name on things? All my romance novels, my name is not on it. I use Selena Montgomery, but that's because my own name was kind of boring. Stacey Abrams does not, wake you up and like, I want to read a romance novel by Stacey Abrams. Especially when you Google her and you find out she wrote about cognitive dissonance. It would be like reading a romance novel by Alan Greenspan. Nobody's And so, but I put my face on every single book that I wrote, and I put my bio in every single book, because I was never going to walk away from it. And I think what women in particular have to be comfortable with is that we have to challenge the dynamics. We have to push back against what people expect of us. That's the only way things change. And I'm not telling people to run out and do something crazy, but sometimes doing something that's a little quirky gets you a little further. But fundamentally, if you are proud of what you do, if you're proud of your art, then you should stand in that pride. And I actually think it makes me more relatable, because when I can talk about, the unrelated business income tax exemption, and I can talk about Mesopotamia astronomy, and I can talk about, hot guy falling for a woman after she eludes him in the Andean mountains, that's also kind of fun.
Forgive me for being inarticulate, and also forgive me for not asking that question. I come from what 12,000 miles are probably the farthest of anyone in this room. And I was listening to you, and you actually stopped me in my tracks because I was actually coming to look at the books, and I heard your voice and actually stopped and came and sat down.
Well, hi.
So I come from Kenya, and mine is about power and the whole dynamic of power. Because if any of you know anything about Africa, so we got our independence going on 60 years in the early 60s. And we always thought, in fact, there was a saying by the Ghanaian president at the time, Kwame Nkrumah, who said, seek ye first political power and everything else shall come unto you, the biblical verse. And we only realized much later that that wasn't enough. And so, if you are from Africa and you're African, the attainment of power is not a problem. The barriers that you would face, maybe the woman thing would be a problem still, but the black thing obviously is not. Probably all our presidents now are black. The problem is once you get there, you then realize it's not enough to just attain it. You also have to understand it, in the sense that you get in there, you hold the office, but you realize the power is held elsewhere. And I dare say, even someone like Obama, who's a personal hero of mine, not just because his father was from Kenya, but also because of how he conducts himself, I dare say he realized that as well. So you can gain the office, you can have all the perks of office, you can do certain things, but you're only able to do, in the time he was given, which is 8 years, we were 8 years in power, he's only able to influence things at the margins. And what I wonder is, maybe there's a question. Once you attain power, because I have no doubt that you will, not just in Georgia, but probably in the country as a whole, how do you sort out this thing of the dynamics of power? So you're in there, you're in office, you obviously have a platform you're standing on, but the whole structure of power sometimes is where the problem is, not the attainment of it.
So, thank you. So here's the thing. There's first and foremost the difference between position and power. Position often has really cool titles, but if you can't do anything with that title, you don't have real power. And a lot of us become very comfortable with a position and a title, not realizing that the person sitting next to us actually has the power. And so the first responsibility is to actually understand what power is in the context of where you are. President Obama held power, but the power he held, he realized very quickly, was going to be more executive than it was legislative. His ability, once he lost the House and the Senate, to actually execute power through the legislative branch was non-existent, which is why we have DACA, which is why we have so many rules that were made that unfortunately this administration is trying to roll back, because he realized that the real power lied in being able to put things in place that were done through executive order. So one of the things I talk about in the book is that you have to understand where the real power is. There's a woman that I met when I was running for office. I was sent to talk to her about raising money, and she told me about the fact that she served in the thrift division of the Department of Treasury during the collapse of the banks. So if you remember the 1980s when that happened, this woman managed billions of dollars, and almost no one knows her name, because it wasn't the position she held, it was the power she held to determine where those new dollars that were coming out of the thrift savings and loans, she decided which new banks got those dollars. And because of her, small banks, especially minority-owned banks, suddenly had cash on deposit that tripled their size. And for almost a decade, these small banks were able to lend and grow minority businesses across the country. Part of the challenge with power is that we get so enwrapped by the title that we forget to look who's actually pulling the strings. And so the first responsibility is not, I want to be governor not because of the title, I want to be governor because I've read the Constitution of Georgia and I know who gets to do what.
Absolutely.
And if the power to do what I want to do could be done while I stayed in the legislature, that's where I would be. But in the state of Georgia, the governor has much more power than anyone else. And if you want to eradicate poverty in the state of Georgia, you need to be the governor of Georgia. If you want to tackle issues of criminal justice, if you want to make certain that families are taken care of, you have to be the governor. or you have to be the person who can make the governor do stuff, and I haven't figured out who that person is, and so I need to be the governor. And so your point is very well taken, which is that attaining power isn't enough, but it's also making certain that you actually attained power and not a position. Because a lot of us get fascinated by positions and by titles and by salaries, and we don't pay enough attention to who's actually making stuff happen. And so my caution, but also my excitement, is that I research a lot. And I know, and I think what President Obama discovered and what a lot of you in this room discovered, is that you also have to figure out what area of the world you're going to change. We can't do everything. It is impossible because too many people want and have power. And there will always be conflicts because there is something that is a bit zero-sum in a lot of the things we want to accomplish. My success means your failure. And when that is the dynamic, then your determination to destroy my power is heightened dramatically. And so it's knowing the difference between position and power, but it's also setting your parameters so that you know how to use your power the most effectively and how to create the most permanent use of that power possible. It's putting in place something, one of my heroes, even though he's deeply flawed, is LBJ. That man created power unlike anyone you can name. And the Republicans have been trying to dismantle his stuff for decades. And if you think about it, he was really only in power for a few years. But it's taken them a long time to tackle what he did, because he understood where power sat, and he understood how to manipulate it. He also understood how to sink it deep into the firmament, so that you had to dig for a long time to pull it out. Yes, sir.
You mentioned your love of political biography, and Stuart Eisenstadt was here last night talking about your fellow Georgian, Jimmy Carter. And part of the discussion revolved around Jimmy Carter's relationship with Russell Long. And I told my friend Samira that she's got to read LSU professor Harry Williams' biography of Huey Long. What other political biographies should I give to her?
So the Huey Long one is perfect. Power Broker by Robert Moses, about Robert Moses by Robert Caro. Like, that's somebody who knew how to manage power. So very quickly, this guy wrote 2 different bills. He was an assistant. Basically, he worked for congressmen, and then he worked for a representative, and he worked for another person.
He had like 4 different jobs at the same time.
And what he did was he created these different jobs. So Robert Moses created the interstate highway system. He also created the parkway system in New York. And if you've ever heard of the Port Authority, I know there was a governor who did some stuff with it recently. He created that too. And then he interlaced their responsibilities so that only the head of one could remove the head of the other. And then he got himself appointed to head them all. And for 40 years, presidents tried to push him out. And they could not, because they had to get him to agree to fire himself. And he wouldn't do it. That is power. He understood both position and power, and he managed to connect them. So The Power Broker is a great book. The entire compendium by Robert Caro of LBJ, because clearly I love them all. The newest book about David McCullough's work on Truman. Well, actually, Grant's good too. But David McCullough's work on Truman, because that's someone who came to power not accidentally as we like to think about it, but not with the same intentionality that someone like an FDR did, but someone, again, who managed to leverage that power in extraordinary ways that we often don't pay attention to. That's where it started.
Great choices.
Thank you.
Hi.
Hi.
How are you?
I'm
So, hello from Film Night.
Yay!
But secondly, I think I came here not intending on asking a question, but then you speak, and I was like, I need to ask a question. So, I similarly have very audacious goals. My mom grew up during the Biafra War in Nigeria, and so from about 5, I decided I was going to end all war, right? Similar to you, and I am firmly committed to that. I'm going to die saying I'm going to do that, obviously, right? Will that come to fruition? Who knows? But I have audacious goals. But I'm finding that I delayed adult life for a really long time, so I now work on the Hill, my first official job. I'm finding that as you sort of navigate professional life and structures of power, it becomes very hard to stay focused on the goal, and you end up fighting about those asinine things or focusing on those asinine things. My colleague said something brilliant to me. I was like ranting about somebody moving my bullet points and the order of the bullet points in my memo. And he was like, why are we in the car talking about bullet points in a memo? And I'm like, yeah, what is going on? There are things to be done. And so I think my question for you is, as you've navigated professional life and structures of power, how have you remained focused on the actual goal as opposed to focusing on just things that have absolutely no impact and are really just ridiculous.
My spreadsheet. but here's what I mean. So the part of it is, part of the reason we get distracted is that it's easier to grapple with minutia than it is to grapple with the headiness of what we want. It is, but it's also overwhelming sometimes. I mean, because the closer you get to actually being able to do the stuff you want to do, the more you realize, man, I don't know if I thought this all the way through. Or what if I try and I don't succeed? Because fear of failure is one of those fears I talk about. But I write everything down. I give myself a structure for what I'm trying to do, but I also give myself checkpoints. So I'm going to call on her. She's going to be embarrassed that I point her out. But so I have this friend named Eliza, and she and I have been friends for a very long time. She's in the book. Because one of the things I realized is that you have to have people that you partner with who hold you accountable. And sometimes it's holding you accountable on the fact that we get comfortable with the minutia. Because the minutia can amp us up, but we can solve it. And once we've solved it, we have accomplished something great. Which is why Congress works.
That's where I work.
Exactly. And so the opportunity is to find someone who serves as your anchor, who keeps pulling you back to why you're doing this. And it's also giving yourself benchmarks. Like, I tell myself, this is how long I'm going to do this. And I can come back to it, and I might decide I'm going to do it for longer, but I have to have a reason for why I'm still doing it. And if I don't give myself a reason, then I have to have an honest conversation with myself. And sometimes I disagree with myself, and sometimes I win, sometimes I lose. But it's making certain that you create external anchors and external checkpoints so that you know why you're doing what you're doing, and you can hit the marks that you're trying to hit. I believe that poverty can be eradicated. I believe I cannot do it alone. So my job is not to eradicate poverty alone, it is to create the systems that then allow other people to help me do it. Because the other part of this, and I talk about this in the book, I've only started one business without a partner. And that was because that was the first one I started. But after that, I've always started businesses with partners because you want someone to balance you. You want someone to challenge you. And I'd rather have 50% of something than 100% of nothing. And so, but we are taught that you're supposed to be the person who solves every problem. You're taught to be the big brain in the room. I'm okay sometimes being the minor brain that kind of helped if it still gets the work done. But that takes a sublimation of ego that we're also taught not to do, especially as people of color, as women, because then you're are you diminishing yourself for all of humanity? No, sometimes you're just letting other people shine. And that's the last thing I'll say about this. So I'm in a primary, and the person running against me is running against me using a bill I asked her to carry that I negotiated for her to be successful with. She's forgotten that part of the story. And there are those who know what happened, who come to me and they're like, are you upset that you did that? Because if you hadn't done these things and basically created space for her to be successful, you might be just coasting. And yes, sometimes I'm very bitter. But 90% of the time I'm not, because part of my obligation, if I'm authentic in what I'm saying, my job is to create space for other people to be successful. And sometimes their success is going to run headlong into mine. And they're going to want exactly what I want because I've told them that that's the right thing to do. Because I've created the opportunity for that to happen. And there's a humility that comes from that I think is a very helpful one. Because it reminds me that when I get to be governor, because I'm going to beat her. But it reminds me that I also need to do that again and again and again. That if you only grow the people who will never challenge you, then you're just as bad as the people who didn't help you.
To start, thank you so much for your presence here and your desire to serve and tackle some of the big issues I had. As a little black girl from Jefferson, Georgia, your presence here is so
And I know where that is.
That's a win. We've grown.
No, we got that part. Yeah. I don't see that.
But earlier tonight you spoke of ambition and what it's often coupled with this fear. So I'm beyond blessed and grateful to be starting at an amazing business school this fall. That being said, I've often been rankled with a thought that you expressed earlier. It's the thought that you're both and I both good enough to gain entry to deserve a seat there, though perhaps still not quite enough to accomplish everything I want to in that way. Can you my question is, can you discuss some of the strategies you've taken or behaviors you've employed to, as you said, confront that fear and befriend it?
Absolutely. So when I went to law school, I used to have braids. I had braids from the time I was a sophomore in college. And I thought I was ready to go to Yale. Okay, they let me in. I clearly was panicking because I cut off all my hair by myself the day before I was supposed to start class. Now, as a black woman, you should know that's a dumb thing to do. If you don't know who's in town to fix your head when you're done. And so I ended up wandering through the streets of New Haven trying to find a barber who could shape my new fro. And the only thing I could find, because no black barbershops are open on Mondays, and that was the first day of school, and I'm like, oh. And so I wander into this barbershop, and it's not a barbershop, it was the only thing that was open, a salon, and there was a Lebanese woman who violently wanted me to perm my hair. And I'm like, woman, I just cut it all off. Perm is not going to do anything. And then she tried to comb it with that little tiny comb. I'm like, that is going to break off in my head. And it took like 2 swipes and it was done. And she went through like 3 combs before she realized maybe I need to upsize the comb. But I say that to say that what I had ignored was the incipient panic that had been riding me since I got there, because I was not prepared to be there. I knew my GPA. I knew my LSAT score. I knew they made a mistake when they let me in. And I grappled with that. And finally what I told myself was, look, they may have made a mistake letting me in, but it's now my job to get out. Your responsibility is not to understand if you're as good as anyone else. It is to be as good as you can be, and to create space for you to understand what that looks like. When you're in a school that's as small as Yale, 170 students. Everyone knows everyone else's business. And you're constantly judging yourself against metrics that are not fair. And they're not relevant. And that's one of the reasons I do the exercises of telling myself what I want. Because it's easy to forget. You suddenly want a clerkship and you know you don't care. I'm like, I don't want to be a judge. I don't really want to be a lawyer. Why am I worried about a clerkship that I'm not going to get? It's because everyone around me is talking about it. You may or may not want to be the master of the universe and run a Fortune 500 company, or maybe you're going because you want to start a nonprofit that helps move capital to small businesses. Remember why you're there. Create space for yourself to change. You can evolve your goals, because as you get more information, you want more. But never forget why you started, because part of what pulls us in that direction of not being enough is that we let everyone else tell us what enough is. And you've got to keep reminding yourself of what enough is for you and what your goal is for you. And then the last thing is talk about it. The worst thing you can do is to sit in silence and fear, to let the pain and the panic overwhelm you until you are sitting with a bald head trying to find somebody to cut your hair with. That was just dumb. And I'm not saying have that kind of psychic break, but give yourself space to be afraid, because that's the thing I talk about. Fear is okay as long as it doesn't become the controller. And so sit with it, understand it, talk to yourself about it, talk to others about it, because somebody else is sharing that same panic, that same fear. They want that same help. And the goal is to find enough of those folks that you create friendships that help you move through this together.
Thank you. Absolutely.
Yes, ma'am.
I believe she was full-time.
I'm just gonna go back and forth because I don't know when you guys pop up, and so. But I appreciate the fairness. This is a very fair room. You guys
Thank you so much for being here and for your work. Really appreciate it. Do you prioritize racial integration and desegregation both in schools and in housing? And what are some of the strategies in your campaign to attack it?
Sure. I do believe that we have to prioritize desegregation, but actually I think it's about prioritizing integration. There are some communities that are so divided that integration has to be part of the goal, but it's also equalization of resources, and sometimes recognizing some groups need more. And that for me is really the goal. It is making certain, the phrase I use is that everyone should have the freedom and opportunity to thrive. And that means that if you are a poor person in Georgia, if you're a poor student, it's going to cost more to educate you. If you are a student who lives in a rural community, it costs more. If you speak English as a second language, if you have special needs, those are all communities that actually deserve and warrant more investment, not less. And so for me, there's absolutely, we know from the work of Hannah Nicole Jones and from others that integration and that racial desegregation is absolutely an imperative, but pursuit of that pursuit of that has to be done at the same time that we're still equalizing opportunity as we go. Because, you know, the South is not exactly known for its success rate at this, and I don't want to wait for that, but I do want to make certain that we are driving the conversation every single day. It's one of the reasons I also talk about how we treat undocumented students in our schools, because no one should be unprotected within our schools, and so I do not believe law enforcement should ever be allowed on those campuses. And we have to make certain that we're creating space for all of these children to have full and rich lives. And whatever that looks like and however we can get there, that's what I'm going to pursue. But I also have to confront the reality that I will be the governor of what will be continue to be largely a Republican legislature, and none of them look like me. And so their instinct towards my goals will not be shared. And so the question becomes, how much can I do with the power and opportunity that is embedded in the governor's office in cooperation with the legislature, but sometimes without convincing the legislature that they agree with me. Okay. If you're in line, you are having a good time. Yes, ma'am.
So I apologize if this comes out a little convoluted. I've had a little bit of time to think about my question, and I think it's got it a little. But I work here in DC at an education nonprofit, and am originally from southern Missouri, not too far north of Arkansas. So coming from a community where most of our politicians pronounce the name of our state wrong, there a lot of communities sometimes have an idea that education and authenticity are at odds. And having relatives in Georgia, I know that that's one of the struggles that Georgia has in some of its communities. How do you combat that coming from a clearly education-loving family and a state that sometimes isn't always supportive of that?
So what you're asking me is, look, we often disparage that which we don't believe we can have, because it then diminishes our sense of loss when we don't get it. I didn't want that. That's ugly, even though I coveted it for a long time. Education is one of those things, when you come from communities where generationally your education is not helpful, it doesn't lead to what you're taught it will lead to, you start to dismiss what it is because you're afraid to want it. And you're afraid to want it for your children because it will lead to more disappointment. That's one of the reasons my parents' story is so important to me. It's why I talk about it. My parents are exact proof that education does not guarantee you anything. My mom and dad did everything they were supposed to educationally, and they still found themselves working poor. But their commitment to education was that they wanted us to understand education for itself and not simply as a means to something else. And when people dismiss it as inauthentic, what they mean is I don't have it and I feel like I'm less because I don't have it, not because I don't want it. And so part of it is, and this goes back to the question the young woman asked about integration and equalization, it's making certain in Georgia that we guarantee you an education no matter where you are. My parents made sure we lived on the poor street on the middle class side of town so we could get zoned into the good schools in Mississippi. So I could take you to Missouri's and raise you in Mississippi. And what they meant by it, but you shouldn't have to have a degree in cartography to get a good education. And for so many communities, the struggle to even guarantee basic education is so hard that it's just easier to say we never wanted it to begin with. Because people don't want to seem ignorant. They don't want to seem like they are less than. And so they create the standards that reflect what they have. And so our responsibility, our obligation, is to guarantee access to education everywhere. So it doesn't matter where you start, you still get the same opportunity. And that's how I approach it in Georgia. Whether I'm in North Georgia or South Georgia or Atlanta talking about education, I talk about it from the vantage point of we all deserve the education no matter what your zip code. Because the best way to make certain people want it is to make it accessible so they know they can have it. And that's how you start to shift the narrative back. Yes, sir.
If you were the governor of Georgia,
When?
the naive New Yorker in the 1980s who encountered the racism of the place and was intimidated by it, and then came back 25 years later and was fascinated by the multiculturalism and the de-emphasis on the Confederacy.
So I grew up in Mississippi. I grew up where our state flag is the Confederate flag. I grew up in a state where when you were in elementary school, you were taken to Beauvoir, the last home of Jefferson Davis, and you see people in t-shirts celebrating as they step around the graves of slaves. I grew up with parents who raised me to understand the real history of the Civil War and post-Reconstruction. And I do not believe that the Confederate monuments that were created not in the immediate aftermath of the Civil War, but the ones that were created post-Reconstruction specifically to terrorize African Americans should have a place of honor on state land. I do not believe that is so. I do not believe there is any other community that would be asked to accept domestic terrorism and to honor it. My belief is that we have to contextualize that history, that those Confederate monuments need to be put in museums, and we need to understand that they were not created in the aftermath. There are a couple that were. They were created immediately in 1879, and other times there's one down in Columbus, Georgia, that was created to basically to commemorate the dead. But it was done right after the Civil War, and that I'm fine with, because that really is a contextualization of history. All of the battlefield monuments, those should be state maintained. But the ones that were created simply to terrorize African Americans because they got too uppity during Reconstruction, the ones that were created and funded by the Daughters of the Confederacy and the KKK, much like the monument on Stone Mountain, those do not deserve places of honor. How we address it, to me, can be as far-reaching as putting additional things on that bas-relief. It can be somehow changing the carving. I don't know, I'm not an artist, but I do know that we have to stop celebrating the terrorism of blacks in America. And we cannot do that unless we acknowledge what precipitated those monuments and why they're currently maintained.
Absolutely.
Your question has to be about bunnies or rainbows.
That's funny you asked, because that's similar to my question. I've had the pleasure to go down to Georgia and volunteer with your campaign, and I'm just so happy that you're here and being able to share the great work that you're going to do in Georgia. My question actually was about self-care. As a Black woman, and as the media kind of presents that Black women often are saviors in the election, whether it's in Alabama or in other states like that. What are you doing for self-care? And kind of as the last question, kind of in the nature of politics, what can we do to help you make sure you get in office?
Those are bunnies, rainbows, and unicorns. Self-care. One, I have amazing friends, and I'm going to name a few of them because they're here and I see them, like Kelly and Stacey, and I saw someone else. Jess, where did you go? Thank you. Okay. It's having people around me who know what I'm going through, who know me for a long time, and can remind me why I'm doing this. And it's helpful. It's helpful to have people who loved you before you started doing stuff, who remind you that they like you. That's one. I watch an inordinate amount of television. I really do. I love TV. It makes me so happy. And I read voraciously. I read everything. And I don't see that there's a contradiction between those two answers. I am waiting to get home because I need to see who won the spring baking championship on Food Network, and Elementary is coming back. I'm very excited about that. Thank you. I know it's taken so long. Dude, you need the last season. Anyway, but yeah, and I read. Like right now, I am reading Where Pt2 Meets Sweet Auburn, which is a story about the civil rights movement and the intersection. It's an important part of Atlanta. I'm also reading a romance novel by Nora Roberts, and I'm very happy about both. And I'm reading about why it's called No Shortcuts, why our labor movements have failed in recent years. Anyway, so I read. What you can do to help. Buy my book. Tell other people about it. but it's also, it's doing what you've done. It's volunteering, signing up on our website. Someone over here had a really good answer.
Donate.
There you go. But it's talking about this campaign. The way we talk about it is 3 M's. Mobilization. Please sign up on our website. Doesn't matter where you are, you can help. We phone bank every single day. We do text messaging. My younger brother Walter, who I adore and love, he is not allowed to leave the state of Mississippi. And so he texted me last week and asked if he could help. And I texted him back very fast and it wasn't as thoughtful about it. And he responded, he's like, I know I've disappointed you, but I promise I won't disappoint you this time. Because he wants to be a part of how I do this. And you know, he's texting. He texted 500 people last week for me. I'm fairly, yeah. So you can do texting, you can do emails, you can send postcards. We'll give you all kinds of work to do. Second is messaging. Talk about this race. Talk about me. There are those who say, oh my God, you shouldn't nationalize a race. Georgia's already a national state. And it's a little late to unring that bell. But it's helpful to me for people to talk about this because if you remember President Obama before Iowa, when people liked his speech, but no one thought he'd be president. But
I was
then,
in Chicago.
but it was when Iowa happened that it became real for others that it could be so. And so for me, because I will be the first Black woman in the history of America to be elected to the governorship, it matters for people to talk about that, not just in the context of history, but in the context of what we talked about today, about what I want to do and why it needs to be done and why you want to see change happen. That messaging should happen on every social network that you have, every platform, and please tag me in it so that people know that it's about me. And it's Abrams, A-B-R-A-M-S. My opponent also, his name's Stacey, so Abrams is important. So it's mobilization, it's message, and then it's money. Money helps a lot because apparently America relies on money. There you go. That's it.
Daughter, you are wonderful. Just wonderful. Who has been most helpful to you in the state of Georgia? Whose help do you need and seek? And when do you sleep?
Mike, look, I've been blessed to have an intersection of women and men of every race and every stripe who've been helpful to me. I need everyone else who hasn't said they want me to change their minds and come on board. And that's why this messaging works, because people hearing from other people, it helps them understand that this is viable and it's possible.
But any particular leaders, historical
I'm on
or
TV.
otherwise?
No, I'm not going to answer that question. I would say this. No, I've been very privileged. I've received
because we all know people in Georgia and elsewhere.
What I would do is ask everybody you know who's in Georgia, ask them if they're supporting me. That's what's helpful.
Okay.
I've been privileged, and Congressman Lewis, Congressman Scott, Congressman Johnson, they've all supported me. C.T. Vivian, Joseph Lowry, Shirley Frank. Well, so we've got a whole group of people who've been supportive and who have been advising to me. So, you know, Mayor Franklin has been an advisor to me throughout my career. There are a lot of folks who are being helpful.
We know, she's a Howard University daughter. Yes.
So they've all been very helpful, but it is helpful to me to tell people, ask them where they are, and ask them if they're not on the right side of history and the right side of this issue to come over to me. And I do sleep. I don't sleep as much as I should, but it's probably in about 2 hours I will be taking a nap because they got me on a plane to New York in the morning. So thank you guys so much.
We have copies of Minority Leader behind our register, so please buy a copy, just as Stacey